Welcome to my story, the story of my life. My name is Eddie Darrell Chaney. I am 62 years old at the time I began to write my story. I was born August the 2nd, 1961 in Hazard, Kentucky. I am the only son of Dorothy Seals and Corbett Chaney. My mother, Dorothy, and my biological father, Corbett, were never married. So, let me start at the beginning. When I was right around 2 years old, my mother married a man named Emmett Clark, and they moved from Whitesburg, Kentucky to Waterloo, Indiana, due to the lack of work in Whitesburg, Kentucky. Then when I was around 7 years old, they moved from Waterloo, Indiana to Cleveland, Ohio. So for a short time, we lived at West 52nd Street off Franklin Avenue in a small downstairs apartment below my mother's brother, Daniel Seals, and his wife, Thelma Jean Gibson Seals. From there, we moved to West 54th Street on the corner of Bridge Avenue in an apartment building, which my mother, Dorothy, and stepdad, Emmett, became the custodians of that building. At this point, things are really looking up for my family. Through the eyes of a child now almost 8 years old, things couldn't be better. For the next 2 years, nothing but good times. I remember visiting some of my mother's family that had moved from Whitesburg, Kentucky to Cleveland, Ohio before my mother and stepdad did. They were such a big help as myself, mom, and stepdad were learning to live life in the big city. At this point, as I share the story of my life with you, I have to let you know something, that I did not call Emmett Clark my stepdad. I called him Dad, and I loved him as any son could love a dad. Okay, now we'll get back to this stepdad, Emmett Clark, in a little bit. Enough said about that right now. Now let me get back to learning life in the big city of Cleveland, Ohio. In the mind and heart of now a 10-year-old boy, I thought everything was just as good could be. I had settled into my new grade school there at Waverly Elementary. I believe the school was located on West 58th Street. I had even gotten used to one of the chores I had to do on Wednesdays after school, which was take out all the garbage cans at that apartment building that my parents were now custodian of on the corner of 54th and Bridge. Now let me tell you, as a 10-year-old boy, I would have rather been playing football with my friends after school than packing 45 garbage cans to the street from around the back of that apartment building. Out of all my chores that I had to do, like making my bed before I went to school or putting my clothes away where they belonged in the dresser and chest, also all the toys put back in their proper place, there in the closet. But taking out the 45 garbage cans was the worst. Listen, they were big, and I'm talking big rats that lived and hanged out in that garbage. But if I didn't do the chores, I didn't get my allowance. To me, the $5 a week allowance was a lot of money, and I could get a lot of quarters, to play the pinball machines, which I loved doing. But little did I know that things were about to change for me and my family. Even with all those chores to do, I thought life was pretty awesome. I could jump on my bicycle and ride a couple of blocks over to my Aunt Downy and Uncle Jim Field's house there on 48th Street and play with my cousins, James Albert, Linda Gale, Meta, or Joyce. And, or I could stay home and hang out between the garages around the back of the apartment building, playing basketball, softball, and sometimes I ate a few mud pies. That Debbie and Sandy Seals, two of the daughters of my mother's brother, Dennis Seals, who I thought was very cool and I loved him very much. Apparently, Debbie and Sandy loved to cook like their mother, Shelby Seals. And at that time, she was the cook I'm talking about, absolutely awesome. I loved eating at my Uncle Dennis and Aunt Shelby's house there in the apartment building. They lived upstairs. It was just awesome. Now, I believe every little boy needs to eat a mud pie or two. Most of the time, you could, find me hanging out with family members from my mother's side. You see, by the time I was 10, there was a whole lot of my mother's family living in the apartment building my parents were custodian of. So I had a lot of cousins. Even with all this family around me, I was starting to make friends with, some of the other boys in the neighborhood outside of my mother's family. The first one I met and befriended was Shorty Bates. Then just a few weeks later, I met his cousin, Milford Posey. Shortly after that, a few other friends I had made in my life. You see, Shorty was about my age, 10. Now, Milford, he was older, about 12 years old. A little older than me and his cousin Shorty. But life could have not been any better for me and my family. But oh, how things are going to turn around. My world is about to be turned upside down and tore apart. Now, as a little boy, just a couple of months away from being 11 years old, I really never had a concept of heaven or hell. Really, I had never been taught nothing about that old devil, Satan, or hell. Neither had I been taught anything about Jesus Christ or heaven. I just thought hell was a place where bad people went, when they died. And heaven was a place where the good people went when they died. I believe that I thought this way during this time of my life because of the conversations I heard my mother having with other adults and family members. As they would talk about my grandpa, her dad, who I did not know. I was just a few days over a year old when my grandpa, Delzy Seals, passed away on August the 7th, 1962. He was 60 years old at the time of his passing. Funeral services were held August the 10th, 1962 at the Charlie Logan Cemetery there in Knott County, Kentucky. Ministers were Charlie Gibson and Andy Bates and R&B Adams and Nelson Seals. You see, my grandpa passed away while at the Mountain Mary Hospital in Hazard, Kentucky, after an illness of 5 years. They say he was a coal mine worker and a moonshine maker throughout his life. He was born in Knott County, Kentucky, a son to James Seals and Alice Ambergy Seals. Sadly, I never heard not one good thing said about this man who I did not know, my grandpa, Delzy Seals, on my mother's side. All I had ever heard was how evil this man was to his family. I mean, I would hear things like, if ever anyone deserves hell, it's him. Hell was created for people like him. He was just pure evil, they would say in their conversations one to another. My mother would cry sometimes as she talked about some of the things that my grandpa, her dad, had done to her, her brothers and sisters, and her mother, my grandmother, his wife, Nanny Sexton Seals. Now, I'm not saying that my grandpa is in hell. What I am saying is, at this time in my life, a little boy about to be 11 years old, but because of the stories I'd heard about this man, I believed hell was a good place for bad people. I loved the thought that bad people were going to get what they deserved, not realizing or thinking that in just a short period of time, I will become one of those bad, mean, and evil people myself. But before we dive into that, since I've shared with you my concept of hell and why I believed that way then, let me now share briefly my concept of heaven. This concept of heaven that I believed in back then, it too, I believe, developed because of the stories I'd heard about my grandmother, Nanny Sexton Seals, who I did know briefly. And those memories are truly treasured moments of my past, even those stories that I heard throughout my life. They have been gold nuggets, pearls of wisdom, words of direction and encouragement. You see, I love my grandmother, Nanny Sexton Seals, with all the heart of a 6-year-old little boy could. Words cannot tell of the love I had and still, even unto this day, at 62 years old, a man sharing the story of his life with you. I can't tell you nor describe the love that I hold in my heart for my grandmother, Nanny Sexton Seals. Everything I ever saw for that short period of time that she was in my life, there was nothing bad, only good. Even the stories that my mother, Dorothy, would share with her family as well as friends outside the family, there was nothing bad ever said about this woman I called grandmother, Nanny Sexton Seals. They spoke of her as an angel, a gift that God had sent to them. Then when she passed away on the 9th day of February in 1967, at the age of 55, she was laid to rest at Charlie Logan Cemetery in Knott County, Kentucky. Even though I was only 6 years old, I will never forget what my mother said to me as she tried to explain that I would never be able to see my grandmother again here in this world. She simply said that another angel had gained her wings and was now at home in heaven with the Lord, and that if I ever wanted to see my grandmother again, that I would have to be a good little boy. And someday, too, I could go to heaven, and that not only would I see my grandmother, but all the loved ones of our family that have passed away and now live in heaven with God. I believe my mother did the best she could at this time of her life to explain a painful, sadly and rough situation to a 6-year-old little boy, and maybe even herself. You see, my mother, Dorothy, and stepdad, Emmett Clark, were not religious people at the time of my grandmother's passing away in 1967. And as for myself, this was the first time I ever heard about angels and who they were. Well, back then, I thought I knowed who they were. Also, this was the first time I'd ever heard the word Lord and God, and I was mad at them, whoever they were. I didn't like them. I was angry at them. because they had taken my grandmother away from me, my mother, and the family. And as time kept moving on, as it always does, I found myself hating them. This Lord, whoever he was, and God, who I knew nothing about, I sure was mad. I was madder than hell is hot and full of anger. I was angry as any 6-year-old boy could be. And this anger was growing hatred in my heart. As you continue to read, I hope you can see and hear that my conceptions of heaven and hell were just a little bit twisted. Well, okay, at this time of my life, they were a lot twisted. I was able from the age of 6 till I was almost 11 years old to hold all this anger and thoughts of revenge that I had toward this Lord and God, who I knew nothing about, but yet I held it inside of myself. I never talked about it to no one, not even my mother's baby brother, Danny Seals, which shortly after the time of my grandmother, Nanny Seals, passing in 1967. Now, my Uncle Danny, after staying with some of the other family members for a short time, then he came to live with my mother, Dorothy, myself, and stepdad, Emmett Clark, there in Cleveland, Ohio, at the apartment building on the corner of 54th and Bridge Avenue. Danny was much more than just an uncle to me. I looked up to him like a big brother. Even though I loved him like a brother, I never said a word to him about what I was going through. But by now, just 3 months away from being 11 years old, the wall that I had built up within myself was about to come crashing down. And everyone, and I mean everyone, starting with my family and friends, yes, the whole world, was going to know that I was mad, full of anger and violence, but they wouldn't know why. Let me try to explain why I believed they didn't know why I was becoming so mean and evil. It all starts when I turned 10 years old. So for the next 9 months, my life seems to be scenes from a horror movie that I'm trapped in, and I cannot get out. The opening scenes of this horror movie start off with me being groomed and then molested by a 45-year-old woman as she steals my virginity and introduces me to the world of sex, perverted and twisted, but nevertheless the world of sex. One of the many twisted things about this situation was that Dora and her husband Tom, who she said would beat me to death with his bare hands if he ever found out what we had done, were not only tenants in the apartment building that my parents were custodians of, but they were good friends with my mother and stepdad, Emmett Clark. You see, Dora and Tom spent a lot of time at my house playing card games like Rummy or Rook, sometimes board games like Monopoly or my mother's favorite game, Yahtzee. My mother trusted her so much that Dora was my official babysitter. Now, as for me, I was just simply too afraid and embarrassed about the things that I had done to tell anyone, even my mother. My mother had no idea what was really going on. At the same time, this twisted and perverted abuse was happening to me. I began to make new friends at school and in the neighborhood, but unfortunately, they were not good friends at all. they were just a little older than me, so they were already drinking and doing drugs. So because of the peer pressure, and I had a desire to fit in, I'd done a little of this and a little of that, but out of all the drugs that I did, so I could fit in with the boys, alcohol and sniffing model car glue were my favorite. I was now skipping school, going in one door and out the other. I was really just looking for the next party so I could get high and try to escape the reality of this horror movie I was trapped in. It was while I was at one of these parties I was introduced to the game, Russian roulette. There was about 30 of us hanging out there in an abandoned building at a place called Whiskey Island. Now, anyone at any time at one of these parties could call for the game of Russian roulette to be played. If anybody wanted to leave, now would be the time. Whoever called for the game would usually run to the door and say money or drugs. The choice is yours. Just pay the man before you leave. And, well, see you next time. That's what they would say. Then in about 15 minutes, he would say the door is closed. And for those that chose to stay, play, and party, all boys and girls alike began to take a card from a deck of 31 cards. This way, all could tell that everyone drew a card. They would be one left on the table face down. Even though all of us drew a card, but not all of us could play the game, so those who got the 6 lowest cards were eligible to play the game. Even if your low card matched someone else's low card, both of you were eligible to play the game. Now, all of those not eligible to play the game, those who drew high cards, could leave with no consequences or continue to party. But those 6 that drew the low cards and were now eligible to play the game of Russian roulette. But if any of them or all chickened out and wanted to quit, they could quit, but there would be consequences. Sometimes it would just be a beatdown from all that was there, and sometimes the one or all those that quit and chickened out would have to lay on the floor or the ground, and without moving or covering their face, they would be spit on directly in their face. As for which form of punishment the coward or the cowards that chose to quit would face, it was left up to the crowd that was still there at the party. As for me, that night, just a 10-year-old boy trying to learn to live life in the big city, feeling trapped in a horror movie that I saw no way out, I drew a high card. This night, nobody dies to win. But 3 boys and 2 girls did get spit on by the 15 of us that had chosen to stay, play, and party with the 6 that had qualified to play the game of Russian roulette. What did the girl that spun the chamber and pulled the trigger win? Her life. And the 9 that left at the beginning, they paid the man at the door. Now, just a few days after this, I got in a fight after school there at Waverly Elementary, there in the parking lot, with 3 boys that was older than myself. I believe they were 12 and 13 years old. As we were fighting, they was really getting the best of me till somehow, I don't even know how I found it, a broken tree limb. Now this equalizer really turned things around for me. As I started swinging, they backed off me pretty fast. Then one of them, they called Copley, pulled a knife and said, "Eddie Spaghetti, I'm going to cut you up and feed you to my dogs." At this point, all I thought about was knocking his head off. So that's what I started trying to do. I beat him in the face and head. I remember there was so much blood that I couldn't recognize his face. By this time, there was a crowd of spectators all around us. They started hollering, "You're killing him." Then they began to rock me. They were picking up rocks out of the parking lot. They were trying to stone me to death, I thought. So I broke out in a run trying to get home. But the crowd of kids were gaining on me. And they're still throwing rocks at me. And some of the rocks are hitting me, which was slowing me down. So I grabbed hold of the first thing I saw, which was a tree. So up the tree I went, thinking that I could kick them in the face if they tried to get me out of the tree. But my plan didn't work. You see, they were now just simply trying to rock me out of a tree. And this is when my Uncle Danny Seals and his friend from school came by and ran the crowd of boys away. Now my Uncle Danny was laughing at me. I know it looked funny, but he had no idea about the fight earlier nor the seriousness of the situation. When we got home, I began to tell my mother about the fight and what had happened, but I don't think she believed the part about the knife. You see, by this time, my mother had caught me in a lot of lies. In just 3 short months after becoming 10 years old, I began to lie about a lot of things. You know, like where I was going when my mother would ask me. I would have to lie, because usually I was going to get high with my friends. You know, I would tell her things like, "You could find me at the park right down below the house," but that's not where I was going. And sometimes when the school would call and say I wasn't there, she would ask me about it, and I would tell her. They simply made a mistake. I was there. But the reality was, I was lying again. And of course, she was starting to catch on. But my mother, who loved me very much, would have never thought nor believed that her son could hold so much hatred and rage toward this person or whatever he was, named Lord or God. Neither would she have thought that her 10-year-old boy was doing drugs and drinking alcohol. You see, to my mother, I was her little angel that could do no wrong. But my mother's way of thinking is about to be changed. Now let me say thank you to all my family and friends that are taking this journey with me as we walk together, as we face the giants in our life like anxiety, panic, worry, depression, fear, and dread. We will be walking through this valley with the great giant killer, our precious Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you once again. Now, if you would like to have a free printed copy of the story of my life, all I ask you to do is call 931-229-0768. You get 3 minutes per phone call, and just somewhere in that moment, as you're talking, whether you're sharing a testimony or an uplifting, encouraging Bible verse or dropping off a prayer request, just say, I would like to receive a free copy of the story of your life. Now, what will happen is I will get back to you in a couple of days. I will message you or call you. I will get your private mailing information and simply mail you each part of the story as we get it printed out into book form. There's going to be many parts to this story because I'll be writing it the rest of my life. But let me just say thank you for your prayers, your patience, love, and support. My prayer for you, friend, is that God would continue to bless you as you continue to be a blessing to others. Thank you for your prayers. Be blessed. Till next time, this is Bishop Eddie Chaney saying, obey God at all cost, knowing that when you face your giant, you're not alone. The great giant killer, Jesus Christ, our precious Lord and Savior, is right there with you, friend. He never and never will forsake us, abandon us, or leave us alone. We belong to Him, those that are born again, bathed in the blood. Be blessed till next time, my friends and family. Be blessed.